Monday morning at Stonebridge High was its usual self. Tired, slow, and thick with a silence that only teenagers at 8:00 a.m. could create. Room 314, tucked at the end of the academic wing, carried the same stale smell of dry erase markers and cold air from overworked vents. At the front stood Mr. Killian, white, mid-50s, crisp navy slacks. The kind of man who took pride in never giving praise unless it was earned twice. He wasn't cruel, just indifferent, which could be worse in certain ways. On the whiteboard behind him sprawled a complex calculus problem, the kind of equation with layer upon layer of nested functions, chain rules, and logs that curled like a snake ready to strike. It wasn't from the textbook. This one was custom built. His signature challenge question that every class failed year after year. Today it appeared unannounced, written in silence, dared into existence. No one even dared to read it out loud. Extra credit if you solve it. Anyone? Mr. Killian finally said, not as an invitation, but as a challenge cloaked in deadpan sarcasm. He folded his arms. He already knew the answer would be silence. The room responded exactly as expected. Heads buried in notebooks, blank stares, students pretending to solve something far less terrifying. But then, like a thread being pulled from the edge of a tightly woven fabric, a hand rose. Javion Carter. His arm went up slow and steady, not to provoke, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had waited patiently for the moment to arrive. Sitting in the third row by the window, Javion looked like someone most teachers wouldn't remember 2 semesters later. Black, thin, neatly groomed locks, eyes sharp behind wireframe glasses. Not disruptive, not popular, just there. And then from the back of the room, a laugh burst out. Brian Monroe, blonde, loud, and twice held back, was the first to crack. His laugh was sharp, forced, the kind used to invite an audience. It worked. Zach, the other half of Stonebridge's dynamic lacrosse duo, followed up with a mocking, "Yo, this dude thinks he's Einstein or something." Laughter spread like spilled soda across the floor, sticky and impossible to clean up. It bounced off walls, desks, and even Mr. Killian didn't stop it. Instead, he smirked slightly. Not openly, just a curl at the edge of his lips. Not enough to be called out, but more than enough to be felt. Javion didn't lower his hand. He just blinked once and continued staring at the board. Savannah, the class president, with a GPA inflated by extra credit and teacher favoritism, whispered loudly to her friend, "Does he even take AP Calc seriously?" More laughter. Mr. Killian cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter," he finally said, "you're welcome to give it a try." It wasn't an invitation. It was bait. A public test. A stage to fail on. Javion stood slowly. His legs felt heavy, not from fear, but from pressure. Years of it. The kind that came with being the only black student in a class full of kids who assumed they were smarter simply because no one had ever told them otherwise. He walked toward the board, ignoring the snickers, ignoring the shaking heads. His footsteps echoed just enough to feel louder than they were. Mr. Killian stepped aside. "Let's see this train wreck," he muttered under his breath, forgetting or not caring that Kira, the quiet girl in the front, heard him. Javion took the marker. Blue ink. Faint smell of alcohol. He stared at the problem once more, then turned his back to the class. And he began. There was no pause. No fumbling. No guessing. His hand moved fluidly, drawing parabolas and partial derivatives, breaking down the problem line by line. He worked from the inside out, simplifying where others would panic, isolating terms with mechanical clarity. The room, once noisy with laughter, went still. The click of pens stopped. Even Zach's gum chewing faded to silence. Javion's heart thudded in his chest, but his mind was elsewhere. In the pages of the calculus workbook he'd secretly borrowed from the community college, in the late nights at the public library, while his mother worked double shifts, in the empty kitchen table sessions where he taught him problems his school never bothered to assign. Every stroke of the marker was a silent rebuttal, not just to the students laughing minutes ago, but to every teacher who ever confused his quiet with disinterest, whoever looked past him when asking for volunteers, whoever grouped him with the kids they thought needed remedial reinforcement. 10 minutes passed, then 15, and then he stopped. The final answer sat at the bottom right of the board, perfectly boxed in, simplified to its cleanest form. Javion turned around, not smiling, not seeking praise, just done. Silent. Mr. Killian stared at the board, his arms slowly unfolding, his brow furrowed. The room waited for the punchline, a correction, a mistake, a gotcha moment that never came. He walked closer, checking the steps, retracing the work. He stopped halfway through and stepped back, like someone touching a flame too hot. Javion remained standing, eyes calm, hands by his side. Then, a voice cut the air. Did he actually get it right? Kira asked, her voice trembling. Mr. Killian didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence was louder than any admission. Javion walked back to his seat. The room remained frozen, not because they didn't believe it, but because they did. For the first time, Javion Carter wasn't invisible, and that terrified them more than anything. But just as he sat down, just as his hand touched his backpack, Mr. Killian finally spoke, voice sharp and clear enough for the whole room to hear. Where'd you learn that solution? You didn't get that from our materials. A pin dropped. Javion blinked. I solved it, he said quietly, but with undeniable weight. Mr. Killian narrowed his eyes. Right. We'll talk about this after class. And just like that, the moment transformed again, not into celebration, but suspicion. Not into admiration, but interrogation. Javion had done the unthinkable. Not just solve the problem, but shift the entire balance of who was allowed to be exceptional. What none of them knew, not even Javion, was that this moment would become the first ripple in a wave that would threaten to drown everything the school thought it stood for. As Javion stepped to the board, the teacher crossed his arms and muttered, "Let's see this train wreck." The sound of laughter from room 314 lingered in Javion's ears, long after the bell released the class, a ghost that followed him down the quiet hallway and out into the parking lot. He walked with measured steps, keeping his gaze low, feeling the invisible weight of stairs behind him, not direct enough to confront but sharp enough to wound. The sky outside Stonebridge High was a pale winter gray, clouds pulled thin like worn fabric, and the wind bit at his face, as if reminding him there were colder battles waiting beyond the school's brick wall. He didn't head straight home. He stopped for a moment at the edge of the sidewalk, gripping the straps of his backpack, hearing the echo of Mr. Killian's suspicion instead of his own success. He whispered under his breath, almost to steady himself. It was right, every step was right, and yet even as the truth lived in the math, doubt had been welded into the air around him. He exhaled slowly, then turned toward the bus stop, the story of how he got here already stitched into every step. Across town, in a modest apartment tucked behind an aging strip mall, Keandra Carter stood at the kitchen sink with her sleeves rolled up, staring at a stack of envelopes spread across the counter like unwanted reminders of the life she fought to outrun. The kitchen light flickered, humming softly overhead, and the refrigerator rattled with a tired groan that never seemed to stop. She had grown used to the sounds of things breaking in slow motion, appliances, promises, the thin protection that came with rent agreements written by men who smiled when they signed and frowned when payment came due. She breathed deeply, steadying herself, rubbing her thumb over the crease of an envelope marked Final Notice, as if friction alone could erase the letters. She didn't tear it open yet. She already knew its tone. Keandra had always believed that silence was a form of survival, the kind taught to black mothers who learned early that anger was a luxury they could never afford. Her sacrifices never left bruises or headlines. They lived in small choices, skipping dinner so her son could eat, pretending not to notice when the lights flickered because the bill would be paid tomorrow, promising Javion everything without ever letting him see how thin the ground beneath them truly was. When people called her strong, they never saw the nights when she sat at that same kitchen table, hands pressed to her face, whispering, "Just one more month. Just let me make it one more month." The first eviction notice had arrived 2 summers earlier, not because she had failed to pay, but because the landlord decided the property needed higher-earning tenants. The letter was typed in casual legal language, but the meaning was clear. She remembered standing in that office, voice calm and polite, asking for an explanation while the property manager smiled thinly and said, "We're moving in a different direction with the resident profile." She had walked out with a shaking chest but steady posture, refusing to let humiliation become visible. That same week, she took a second job cleaning offices after hours, leaving home at midnight while the city slept, returning just as the sun rose over cracked sidewalks and tired storefronts. For Javion, those nights became study hours. The kitchen table became his classroom, his desk, his lifeline. The used laptop she bought from a pawn shop overheated constantly, its fan wheezing like an old train engine. But he protected it like something sacred. She had saved for months to buy it, collecting loose change, selling old furniture, bargaining with strangers on Facebook Marketplace, each transaction layered with the fear that someone might recognize desperation in her voice. The textbooks she found came from thrift stores, yard sales, and library clearouts. Pages scribbled with notes from students who never once imagined their handwriting would become a stepping stone for a boy they'd never meet. Sometimes when she came home from the night shift, she'd find him asleep at the table, cheek pressed to open equations, pencil slipping from his fingers. She never woke him immediately. She would just stand there for a few seconds, heart heavy and proud at the same time, whispering softly, "You won't disappear in this world, baby. Not you." Then she'd drape a coat over his shoulders and let him dream for a few more minutes. Their plan wasn't written down anywhere, but it was real. He would get farther than she ever had, past the tiny expectations placed on boys who looked like him. She didn't want him merely to survive school. She wanted him to rupture the assumptions that wrapped themselves around his name. When neighbors asked why he always carried extra books, why he didn't hang around after class, she smiled and said, "He has plans." What she didn't say was how urgently she needed those plans to work. Because every bill reminder, every rising rent notice, every microaggression at work, carved another deadline into the walls of their life. That afternoon, when he walked through the front door, Javian tried to appear ordinary, the way children learn to protect their parents from worry they think they can control. He dropped his backpack quietly, forcing his shoulders to appear lighter than they were. Kiandra turned from the counter and studied him the way only a mother could. Seeing the tension he tried to erase. "You okay?" she asked gently, not pressing, just opening a door. He hesitated. Then, with a faint, tired exhale, he nodded. "Yeah, just school." She dried her hands on a faded kitchen towel, stepping closer. "School can be heavy, and still be worth carrying," she said softly, offering comfort without intruding. "You want to talk about it?" He thought of the laughter, the stares, the teacher's smirk lodged between silence and accusation. "I solved something nobody else could," he said finally, voice low. "And instead of being proud, they looked at me like I cheated." Her jaw tightened for a split second, a reaction she smoothed over before he could see. Then they saw something they didn't expect. She replied, steady, knowing, "That doesn't make your work smaller. It makes their world smaller." He nodded slowly, letting her words settle inside him like quiet armor. He didn't tell her about the promise of a conversation after class. He didn't tell her about the doubt in the teacher's eyes. Not yet, because tonight he wanted her to rest, and she wanted to believe just for a few hours that his brilliance had finally been allowed to exist without consequence. As evening deepened, the apartment fell into the familiar rhythm of their routine. The lamp by the couch hummed softly. The kitchen light flickered again, and Kiandra made a mental note to call maintenance. A useless ritual she performed even though she knew the landlord rarely fixed anything unless a different family complained. She tucked unpaid bills into a neat stack, then slid them under an old photo album as if hiding them beneath memories might reduce their urgency. For a moment there was peace, a fragile kind, but real enough to breathe in. Later, when Javion returned to his books, Kiandra slipped her keys into her coat pocket for the night shift, pausing beside him. "You know," she said quietly, "when you look at those pages, don't think you're alone in them. Every line you solve, I'm right there." He looked up, eyes softening. "I know," she smiled, the kind that carried both exhaustion and faith, then left, the apartment door closing with a familiar soft thud. Midnight wrapped the building in quiet, but under the silence lived the things nobody spoke about. The biased maintenance requests that remained unanswered, the accidental rent increases applied only to tenants who shared her skin tone, the landlord who never said anything openly racist, but always found a reason to remind them they were lucky to be here at all. Kiandra worked through the night, vacuuming empty conference rooms while listening to the echo of office chairs scraping against tile, thinking about Javion's future as if every surface she wiped was another barrier she scrubbed thin. When she finally returned near dawn, she paused outside their apartment door, breathing in the stillness, whispering a small prayer that the mail slot would remain empty that day. But as she stepped inside, the morning sun stretched pale light across the floor, revealing yet another envelope tucked beneath the doorframe. The landlord's letterhead stared back at her like an unwanted witness. She didn't open it immediately. Instead, she walked to the kitchen, set her purse down, and allowed herself one steady inhale. Only then did she tear the envelope at the seam. Her eyes traced the lettering once, twice, then stopped. The words didn't say late payment. They didn't say rent adjustment. They said something worse, something cold and efficient. Lease subjected to review pending tenant compliance inquiry. She read the paragraph again, dread rising in slow, measured waves. The letter cited behavioral disturbances reported to management, and concerns regarding household activity. None of it made sense. They were quiet. They followed rules. They stayed invisible. Then she saw the line that stole the air from her chest. A complaint filed the same day Javion was accused at school. Her fingers tightened around the page as she whispered into the empty apartment. "They're watching us." Before she could gather her thoughts, before she could sit or breathe or call someone who might help, a sudden heavy knock rattled the door. Sharp, deliberate, the kind that didn't wait politely. Someone was on the other side, and the news they carried was about to unravel everything she had built. The knock at the door faded into morning, leaving behind only shadows and dread. Keandra stood frozen, clutching the lease violation letter in one hand, while the other hovered near the lock. Whoever had been on the other side didn't wait. They left no name, no business card, only the sharp echo of power, reminding her that watching wasn't the same as being protected. She didn't wake Javion. Instead, she pressed the letter against the refrigerator with a magnet, face down, and let the silence stretch until the sound of the school bus brakes rolled in like thunder. She kissed her son on the forehead as he walked out the door, and neither of them mentioned the heaviness in the air. At school, room 314 looked exactly the same. Desks arranged like a battlefield, calculators resting like armor, fluorescent lights buzzing their usual sterile rhythm. But everything had shifted. Javion walked in with the same backpack, the same posture, the same determination not to take up more space than necessary. Yet, as he passed rows of students, he felt the difference in the way they glanced at him. Shorter stares, longer whispers, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but predictive. No one laughed this time. No one smiled. They didn't need to. The mood had turned cold in a way that couldn't be charted on a board. He was no longer just the quiet kid who did his homework. He was the one who had shown them up. He was the one who had made the teacher look unsure. And in their world, that was the kind of genius that demanded punishment. Mr. Killian didn't even greet the class that morning. He handed out a pop quiz, face stiff, voice flat, eyes never once meeting Javion's. The questions were basic, far below the problem Javion had solved just the day before. It was a message. This wasn't about assessment. This was about establishing control. Javion finished first. He always did. He placed his paper on the teacher's desk, quietly, respectfully, and returned to his seat. The rest of the day was a slow unraveling. In physics, his lab partner, Mason, avoided eye contact. In English, his seat was suddenly reassigned. In the lunchroom, his usual spot by the window was taken by Brian and Zach, who stared at him like he had trespassed somewhere sacred. The cafeteria felt louder than usual, the laughter sharper, the glances more rehearsed. He didn't belong, but not because he failed. He didn't belong because he succeeded. By the time he returned to room 314 for his next calculus class, the air was thick with something else. Not just distance, not just judgment, but accusation. Mr. Killian stood at the front again, arms folded, eyes scanning the class. "Before we begin," he said, his voice coated with fake professionalism, "I want to address something from yesterday's session. The problem solved on the board was complex, highly advanced, not typically mastered at this level." The room was still. Javion felt his stomach tighten. "There are concerns," Mr. Killian continued, "that the solution may not have been original work." Every muscle in Javion's back stiffened. "We take academic integrity seriously here. If anyone used unauthorized sources or copied answers, there will be consequences." He didn't say Javion's name. He didn't have to. The damage was in the doubt. Javion opened his mouth to speak, but before any words formed, the school counselor, Mrs. Whitlock, appeared at the door. Her gentle knock was barely audible. "Javion," she said, "can I see you for a moment?" The room turned to watch as he stood, each step to the door like walking into a courtroom with no defense. She didn't say much as they walked down the hall, only smiled tightly and said, "Nothing to worry about, just a quick check-in." But he knew better. That wasn't a check-in smile. That was a "you're already in the system" smile. Her office was painted in soft blues and greens, calming tones that couldn't hide the tension of the moment. She gestured for him to sit. "How are things?" she asked, voice syrupy and slow. "Fine," he replied. "Steady. I heard you did something impressive in calculus yesterday. Solved a very difficult problem." He nodded once. "And now, there's some confusion," she continued, tapping a manila folder on her desk. "We're not making any assumptions, of course, but Mr. Killian said the work seemed beyond the scope of what's taught here." Javion frowned. "It wasn't on the curriculum, but I studied it." "Studied it? How?" "On my own." She tilted her head slightly. You do know the internet isn't considered an academic source, right? His eyes narrowed. I used textbooks. College ones. I worked through the material. Mrs. Whitlock smiled again. The kind of smile adults use when they don't believe kids but want to pretend they do. We're just trying to understand. When someone does something that's unexpected, it can raise questions. Unexpected. That was the word again. Not wrong. Not incorrect. Just unexpected for someone like him. You mean because I'm black? Javion said. His voice quiet but pointed. Her smile faltered. No one is saying that, but the silence screamed it. That afternoon, whispers grew louder. A rumor had started. Someone said Javion stole the answer from an online tutoring site. Another said he got the problem from a cousin in college. Someone else claimed he'd been bragging in the hallway about tricking the teacher. None of it was true, but it didn't matter. The truth was drowning in the noise, and none of the teachers stopped it. Not even Ms. Gomez, who had always smiled at him during lunch duty, met his eyes that day. It wasn't just students anymore. It was adults. The next day, Javion's locker was found open. Nothing missing. Nothing stolen. Just disturbed. His notebooks shuffled. His pencils scattered. His flash drive turned upside down. It was a message. No vandalism. No proof. Just enough to unsettle. He went to the vice principal. Filed a report. They told him maybe he forgot to lock it. Told him there was no security footage. Told him to stay vigilant. He began to feel his world close in, inch by inch, hallway by hallway. Even in the classroom, questions he answered correctly were now double-checked before being marked right. When he raised his hand, teachers hesitated before calling on him, like his answers came with a risk. And still he studied. Still he wrote. Still he solved problems with the precision that no longer felt like a gift, but a target. Kiandra noticed the change but didn't press. She simply cooked his favorite meals more often. Left small notes in his backpack. Keep going. You're not crazy. They're scared of what you know. But her eyes, those tired, beautiful eyes, they were watching the walls too, waiting for the next crack. Then it came. One rainy Thursday, Javion was called to the principal's office during fourth period. The hallway felt longer than usual, each step echoing like it knew something he didn't. Principal Marston was seated behind her wide wooden desk, her face unreadable. She didn't ask him to sit. Javion, she began, I wanted to make you aware of something before it gets out of hand. She reached into a folder and pulled out a single printed email, sliding it across the desk like it was made of glass. His name was in the subject line. The sender was anonymous. He read the first line, and his breath caught. Student appears to be manipulating coursework using unauthorized software to falsify academic performance. He looked up. This isn't from a teacher, Principal Marston said. This came from a parent. A stranger, someone who'd never met him, but still believed he didn't belong. She watched him, waiting for a reaction. Javion stared at the paper, chest heavy, the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths pressing into his ribs. Because if they could accuse him now without evidence, without logic, what would they do if he kept rising? The principal calls Javion into her office and slides a printed email across the desk, an anonymous accusation that could destroy his future. The email lay on the desk between them like a quiet verdict, its words printed in clean black ink, but heavy with accusation. Javion read the paragraph again, slower this time, as if careful pacing might change the meaning. Unauthorized access. Suspicious academic irregularities. Potential breach of faculty files. The language was professional, sanitized, almost polite, but every line dripped with the same conclusion. Someone wasn't accusing him of being brilliant. They were accusing him of being dishonest. Principal Marston folded her hands, watching him closely, the way someone studies a fragile object they aren't sure how to handle. This allegation has already reached the district office, she said softly, her tone calm in a way that made the moment more terrifying. We're required to investigate. He swallowed, holding the page firmly to keep his hands from shaking. I didn't hack anything, he said, steady, deliberate, refusing to let desperation make his voice tremble. I don't even have access to any files. I understand that's your perspective, she replied, emphasizing your, as if truth were subjective. But when a concern like this comes from a parent community, we have to consider the optics. Optics. The word echoed in the room like a camera shutter closing on him. Within 24 hours, rumors mutated into policy. He arrived at school the next morning to find that his ID card no longer scanned at the math club room. The notice on the door read, "Temporary member restriction pending review," typed in a neat serif font. His name wasn't mentioned, but his absence was obvious enough to be deliberate. The same afternoon, his schedule was quietly adjusted. Honors calculus was temporarily reassigned, and his name disappeared from the academic leadership roster without warning. When he went to ask for clarification, the counselor greeted him with a carefully measured smile. "This might be a good time to keep a low profile," Mrs. Whitlock suggested gently, as if she were offering comfort. "Just until things settle." "Settle from what?" he asked, voice tightening. "I didn't do anything wrong." She tilted her head, the familiar expression of soft deflection returning to her face. "Sometimes doing less is safer than defending more." Her words weren't advice. They were containment. Security began appearing near his classes. Not aggressively, not openly confrontational, just present. A guard lingered by the science wing during his lab period. Another appeared near his locker at lunch. Whenever he walked past, radios clicked softly, as if his footsteps synced with surveillance. No one explained why. No one said his name. That was the cruelty of it. They didn't accuse him aloud. They simply redesigned the environment, until suspicion felt like gravity. Meanwhile, the white student, who laughed the loudest the day Javion solved the equation, suddenly became the new star. Brian was now referred to as promising, natural talent, a potential scholarship candidate. His name appeared on a poster advertising the upcoming math tournament, a position Javion once held quietly, without celebration. Teachers congratulated Brian in the hallway. The counselor told him he had a bright academic future. Javion heard it in passing, and in those small hallway exchanges, the message rang louder than any policy statement. The room had space for only one genius, and it wasn't going to be him. The sabotage came in subtle forms first. His graded assignments were returned late, sometimes not at all. Extra credit opportunities were announced in class, but never emailed to him. When he requested recommendation letters, he was told they should wait until concerns are fully resolved. Miss Darian stopped calling on him entirely, even when he raised his hand with careful patience. It wasn't just avoidance, it was erasure. At home, Keandra read every policy document she could find, every district regulation, every appeals process page. She stayed up late at the kitchen table again, tracing sentences with her finger, whispering, "They can't just take things from him. They don't get to rewrite the work he did." But she also knew how systems worked. She had seen them bend truths into shapes that always seemed to disadvantage people who looked like her son. One afternoon, as rain streaked the windows of room 314, Javion lingered behind after class. Mr. Killian was erasing the whiteboard with slow, deliberate strokes, refusing to look at him. "I'd like to know what I'm being accused of," Javion said, his voice calm, firm, controlled. "At least tell me where this came from." Mr. Killian paused, marker still in his hand. "This isn't personal," he said after a moment. "It's procedural." "You think I cheated," Javion replied, not accusing, simply stating the truth that hovered between them. The teacher finally turned. "I think your performance was inconsistent with measurable classroom evidence. Or maybe your expectations were inconsistent with me," Javion answered quietly. Silence filled the room, thick, unresolved, neither shattered nor softened. From the back doorway, someone watched. Mrs. Aldridge, the literature teacher with soft eyes and a tired posture, had paused mid-stride, as if drawn by something deeper than curiosity. She remained still, invisible to both of them, listening not to the words themselves, but to the undercurrent running beneath them. For weeks she had noticed changes, the sudden distance around Javion, the careful ways teachers rewrote conversations when his name entered them, the fragile edge in his shoulders when he walked past her room. She waited until the hall had emptied before approaching him. "You don't have to explain anything to me," she said gently, "but I see what's happening." He didn't respond immediately, because he'd grown used to being observed, not defended. "No one else does," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Her gaze deepened. "Some of us do. We're just told to stay quiet." That night, as sheets of rain rattled the metal edges of the school roof, Ms. Aldridge sat alone in her classroom, staring at her computer screen, long after grades were posted and emails answered. She had been in enough faculty meetings to know how narratives formed and how they hardened. She remembered the half-jokes, the dismissive comments, the disguised prejudices wrapped in academic language. She remembered hearing a teacher laugh once when reviewing test scores and say, "Well, we know who didn't do this honestly." She hadn't said anything then. Her silence haunted her now. So she started searching. Quietly. Carefully. She combed through meeting minutes, internal memos, archived communications. She didn't break into anything. Didn't hack. Didn't cross one technical line. She simply read what had been left lying in plain sight, because power never imagines the wrong person reading. Patterns emerged, repeated phrases, flagged student records worded in eerily similar ways, terms like overconfident, misaligned performance, potential external assistance. Names were familiar, faces were predictable. The bias wasn't loud, it was procedural. The next morning, her decision was already made, before she entered the building. Her hands trembled, not from fear of consequences, but from the weight of finally refusing to be silent. She waited outside, near the courtyard where students crossed between buildings. Javion appeared, shoulders straight despite exhaustion, his eyes determined despite everything stripping at his edges. She approached without ceremony, voice low, steady, urgent. "Walk with me," she said. They moved along the side of the building, where the sunlight barely touched the brick, and the sounds of laughter from other students felt distant and unreal. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she stopped, turning toward him, the resolve in her gaze unmistakable. "You're not imagining this," she said. "You're not overreacting. What they're doing, it isn't just about one math problem." His throat tightened. "Then what is it about?" "It's about control," she answered, "and narratives they don't want to change." She reached into the inside pocket of her coat and pressed something small, cold, and metallic into his palm. A USB drive. He stared at it, confused, cautious, breath shallow. Her voice dropped to a whisper, not dramatic but urgent, protective, unwavering. "Don't let them erase you," she said. "What's on here will blow this wide open." He closed his hand around it, feeling for the first time not just fear or anger, but possibility. The kind dangerous systems never plan for. And far down the hallway, a security camera blinked red, recording a moment neither of them yet understood. Ms. Aldridge places a USB in Javion's hand and whispers, "Don't let them erase you. What's on here will blow this wide open." Javion didn't open the USB that night. He waited until the apartment was completely silent, until Keandra had fallen asleep, her body curled up in exhaustion from the third shift, the lights dim and the television humming faintly in the background. He sat alone on the floor beside the couch, the glow of his laptop flickering off his glasses. His fingers trembled slightly as he slid the USB into the port. The laptop's fan wheezed like an old engine, and then the folder opened. It was labeled Staff Observations 2018-2024. Inside were subfolders: student conduct, classroom trends, parent concerns, performance flags. He clicked the first one, heart racing. What opened wasn't a spreadsheet or gradebook. It was a trail of quiet sabotage that had lived in plain sight for years. Every file was cold and calculated, written in neutral language, polished tone, and masked intent. But every sentence was another dagger. Teacher notes, internal comments, risk assessments, academic reports. They didn't use the language of racism, but Javion didn't need them to. The bias wasn't loud. It was procedural. He searched for his own name. It appeared 17 times. Javion Carter, freshman, unusually assertive in group work, needs monitoring, displays persistent challenging tone when correcting peers, potential attitude issue, overconfidence. Consider counseling referral if it escalates. Line after line, file after file, year after year, they had been tracking him, not his struggles, his confidence. His performance wasn't seen as potential. It was seen as a red flag. And then he looked deeper and realized it wasn't just him. Melik R. frequently wears a hoodie in class. Avoids eye contact. Passive defiance. Tyrone M. loud during group activities. Escalation risk. Every single name. Black students. He checked the profiles of the white students who often disrupted class. The language was entirely different. Brian M. high energy. Shows charisma. Room leader. Zach T. bold personality. Needs light direction. Good leadership potential. Same behavior. Different narrative. Javion kept scrolling, feeling his chest tighten with every click. Then he saw it. A comment in his own record, buried deep from sophomore year. Javion shows accelerated content mastery, but resists classroom hierarchy. Not ideal for AP advancement. They didn't doubt his intelligence. They resented it. He opened a protected file titled Student Escalation Watchlist. The password was easy. Stonebridge 2021. Inside a list of students, every name on the list, black, and next to JC pattern suggests defiance disguised as performance. Monitor. Javion leaned back in his chair, chest burning. For years they had tracked him like a liability, while telling him he was lucky to be here. His success had been labeled suspicious. His discipline had been marked as dangerous. His brilliance had triggered surveillance. He downloaded everything. All of it. Made 3 encrypted backups. Then he pulled the USB out of the laptop and held it in his palm. This wasn't just evidence. It was a detonator. The next morning, he walked into school, ready to show the world the truth. But when he opened his locker, the USB was gone. Everything else was untouched. Books in place. Calculator in its case. Only the secret envelope he'd taped behind the top shelf hung open. The adhesive peeling like someone had just torn the future from his hands. He searched every pocket. His bag. The lining of his jacket. Nothing. Gone. He reported it immediately. The front desk assistant nodded, took down a note, and said blandly, "We'll let you know if anything turns up. No urgency, no surprise, no action." Back in class, Javion noticed something different in the way people moved around him. Calmer. Almost satisfied, as if they sensed the power shift without knowing why. Someone had gone through his locker, and they took only the thing that mattered. It wasn't just theft, it was a message. We see you, and we're still in control. That same afternoon, just before final period, his name was called over the intercom. Javion Carter, please report to conference room B. School board delegates are waiting. Not the principal's office, not the counselor's room. Conference room B, a space reserved for press briefings, political damage control, and parent administration negotiations. He walked through the empty hallway, his shoes echoing louder than normal, until he reached the frosted glass door. Inside were 3 people. Principal Marston. Superintendent Rayburn. A tall, pale man with polished shoes and a politician's smile. And a third figure. A woman in a gray suit, unfamiliar. Her eyes already locked on him. No one offered a greeting. No one smiled. "Javion," Rayburn began, gesturing at the lone seat across from them. "Thanks for joining us." He sat down slowly, trying not to let his hands shake. "There's been a development," the gray-suited woman said, sliding a printed screenshot across the table. It was a grainy frame of the security footage, Javion and Miss Aldridge speaking behind the school. "You're not under formal investigation yet," she said, "but this raises concerns." Javion blinked. Concerns about what? About unauthorized materials. Possible leaks of confidential files. About influence. "I didn't leak anything," Javion replied. "She gave me what the school was hiding." "We're not accusing anyone," Rayburn cut in, smoothly. "But we're in a delicate position. Your academic conduct has already raised red flags. And now, this." "She's not the one being accused," Javion said. "But I am." No one responded. The silence was answer enough. "We've already informed your mother," the woman continued. "She should be arriving shortly. But before she does, we're giving you the opportunity to explain your side. Before this goes any further." He didn't speak. He didn't nod. He just looked at the image again. The moment frozen out of context twisted into suspicion. And then the door opened. Keandra walked in, calm, composed, but with fire in her eyes. "You wanted a parent?" she said, placing her bag on the table. "Well, here I am." Rayburn stood halfway, but she waved him off. "Sit down. You're not the one in charge here anymore." She pulled out a thick folder, a printed backup of everything Javion had saved. She dropped it on the table, the weight of it louder than her voice. "You want to talk about violations?" she said. "Let's talk about yours." The room went still. Nobody reached for the folder, because they already knew what was inside. The superintendent opens with, "We've received troubling footage of you. Care to explain?" The morning after the school board confrontation, Stonebridge High was unusually quiet. Not the kind of quiet that followed a storm, but the kind that preceded one. Javion noticed it the moment he stepped off the bus. Students moved in tight circles, eyes darting between screens, and side glances. He couldn't hear what they were watching, but he could feel it, like heat radiating off invisible fire. It wasn't until he reached the courtyard that he saw the first phone pointed at him. By third period, he knew something had happened. By lunch, the truth hit him like a slow, suffocating flood. The video was 37 seconds long. It had been posted anonymously overnight, and stitched together with shaky narration and manipulated captions. It showed Javion standing in front of Mr. Killian, voice raised, hands moved. The audio was muffled, key lines edited out, but the imagery had been perfectly timed. The clip paused just as Javion stepped forward, framed to look confrontational. Then it cut to the teacher flinching slightly, and the screen flashed red with text. Angry black student threatens staff over grade dispute. The views were already past 1. By the next hour, it was trending on TikTok under hashtags like Stonebridge Scandal and entitled students. Comments flooded in, a mix of confusion, racism, and outright threats. These kids think yelling equals intelligence. Imagine if this was your child's teacher. But he's done this before. Some were worse. Some called him a thug, a manipulator, a violent threat to school safety. None of them asked what actually happened. None waited for context. Even students who had once sat silently beside him now watched from a distance. His table in the cafeteria, once barely tolerable for others to share, now sat completely abandoned. Friends who once greeted him with nods now avoided eye contact. Savannah, who once asked to borrow his notes for extra credit, walked past him like he didn't exist. At home, Javion sat frozen on the couch, phone in hand, scrolling through his own name. On every platform, his DMs were full of slurs. Fake accounts tagged him in doctored screenshots, making up proof of past incidents that never happened. His face, quiet, focused, tired, was now plastered across the internet as the latest cautionary tale of what happens when a black boy goes too far. Keandra returned from her shift and immediately sensed the air had changed. She didn't ask right away. Instead, she set her purse down, removed her shoes, and looked at her son with the kind of patience only black mothers learn to develop in emergency. When he finally showed her the video, her hands stiffened before her face did. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. She simply asked, "Where's the full version?" Javion shook his head. "I don't know. Someone cut it up. That's not how it happened." "I know it's not," she said, "but they're gonna treat it like it is." That night, her phone rang 4 times, 2 from unknown numbers, 1 from a local reporter, and 1 from a college prep advisor, who had once promised Javion a direct line to MIT. The advisor's voicemail was short, clipped, and awkward. "Given recent developments, we're going to pause any endorsement letters until further clarity is achieved." The email from the scholarship committee arrived just after midnight. "We regret to inform you that your application is being re-reviewed due to questions surrounding student conduct. This does not represent a final decision." Javion didn't sleep. He couldn't, because now it wasn't just about the classroom. It wasn't just about school board meetings or internal files, or teacher bias. Now it was about public perception, and public perception didn't wait for investigations. It convicted with clips. The next morning, the principal made an official announcement over the intercom. "We are aware of a recent video circulating on social media. While we do not condone the public sharing of incomplete information, we encourage students to remain respectful during this sensitive time."
No defense. No correction. Just hollow neutrality.
But somewhere inside the school, someone had the full video. Javion remembered something. A flash of silver in the top corner of the classroom. The school's security system. Every classroom had cameras installed 2 years ago, under the district's safe learning environment policy. They rarely acknowledged it, but they were there. Silent, watching. The real video existed, and someone had access to it. The problem was, the person who did was scared to release it. Ms. Aldridge, she had been distant since the meeting, avoiding eye contact in the halls, replying to emails in one-word answers. Javion approached her after class one day, quietly. "Do you know anything about the footage?" She looked up sharply, her eyes flashing fear. Not of him, but of something else. "I shouldn't be involved anymore," she said, voice tense. "They're watching now." "I'm getting threats," Javion whispered. "I know," she replied, her voice cracking slightly. "I saw them, but if I release something now, they'll come for my job, my pension, everything." Her hesitation wasn't cruelty. It was fear, a fear Javion knew too well. That night, Keandra said nothing. She just opened the fridge, pulled out leftovers, and placed them on a plate for him. As he ate in silence, she sat across from him and stared at the small pile of bills growing again on the kitchen counter. "They want you tired," she said softly. "They want you too tired to fight back. That's why they do it like this. Quiet, slow, so that when you finally break, it looks like your fault." "I didn't even raise my voice," Javion muttered, more to himself than to her. "And that's the part they can't stand," Keandra said. "You beat them at their own game, and they can't delete that, so they'll rewrite it." Her voice was calm, but her eyes were burning. By morning, the story had made it to local news. The edited clip aired during a segment on increasing school aggression. Javion's name wasn't spoken, but his blurred face was enough. Teachers started stepping away from him during breaks. Security was doubled in the math wing, and whispers of probation began to drift from the admin hallway. Then, just as everything felt like it was closing in, something changed. Keandra went to check the mailbox on her lunch break. The rusted metal flaps squealed like always, and the usual stack of flyers and late notices greeted her. But one envelope stood out. It was plain, white, no return address, only one line typed across the front.
Evidence they're afraid of.
She paused, holding it like it might burn her fingers. The paper was thick, high quality, not school-issued, not mailed from any government building. She looked around, heart beating faster, then slid it into her bag and walked straight back inside. She didn't open it right away. She waited until the apartment was still again, until Javion had gone to shower, and the television hummed quietly in the background. Then she sliced it open with her fingernail and pulled out the USB. No label, no note, just the drive. Her hands trembled as she plugged it into the laptop. It opened instantly. One folder. Uncut. March 13th. The video loaded in high resolution. Classroom. Board. Javion. Mr. Killian. Every word. Every movement. No edits. No spliced angles. Just truth. And it was devastating. Javion never raised his voice. Never gestured aggressively. Mr. Killian was the one who escalated. The teacher had baited him, interrupted, raised his tone, and Javion, despite it all, remained calm, clear, focused. The footage was everything the internet hadn't seen, and everything the school didn't want anyone to see. Keandra leaned back in the chair, eyes wide, heart pounding. Someone had given them a loaded weapon, and she was about to pull the trigger. Keandra opens their mailbox to find an envelope, labeled evidence they're afraid of. The folder sat like a time bomb on the table. No one dared touch it, but everyone knew what it contained. Rayburn leaned back in his chair, a stiff political smile creeping across his face, the kind used when cornered but unwilling to surrender. Principal Marston kept her hands folded, staring blankly at the grain of the wood, her body present but her spirit hiding elsewhere. The woman in the gray suit didn't blink. Keandra, standing tall with fire in her posture, didn't need to speak again. She'd said what mattered. The truth was no longer something they could bury, not without leaving blood on their hands. Still, Rayburn recovered first. "We appreciate the concern," he said smoothly, "but we'll need to verify the authenticity of these documents before making any administrative changes." Keandra raised an eyebrow, her voice steady. "Verify your own files then. They're yours." Javion didn't move. He could feel the shift in the room, the way authority tightened its grip when exposed. But he also knew that exposure alone wouldn't bring change. These people didn't fold under truth. They adapted to survive it. Later that evening, long after the meeting dissolved into silence and veiled threats, word traveled fast. A school-wide email quietly announced an emergency board session scheduled for Thursday. No explanation, no agenda, but the students knew. The teachers knew. And by the time Javion found out through a forwarded screenshot, the decision had already been set in motion. The school was preparing to expel him. There would be no open hearing, no platform to defend himself. Just 5 people, a room with closed blinds and 1 vote, 5 signatures, 1 student, and an entire future hanging from a thin piece of paper. At home, Keandra read the forwarded message 3 times, her hands stiff with disbelief. She didn't scream. She didn't throw the phone. She just stood, moved to the kitchen sink, and turned on the faucet, staring out at the night, like it might answer back. The water ran, untouched, a quiet soundtrack to her spiraling thoughts. Javion broke the silence, his voice low. "Even with the files, even with everything, it's not enough, is it?" Keandra didn't turn. Her voice was quiet but heavy. "Not unless someone on the inside speaks up. Not unless they hear it from one of their own." They both knew who that was. Ms. Aldridge, the teacher who had quietly passed Javion the first USB. The one who had seen the rot up close, who had heard the whispers in meetings, who had already risked more than she admitted. But saying something silently was one thing. Stepping forward publicly was another. The next day, Javion found her after school. Her classroom was dim, books half-packed, the smell of dry erase markers still clinging to the air. She stood at her desk, moving papers without focus, as if trying to pretend her world wasn't collapsing from within. "I need to talk to you," Javion said softly. She paused, then turned slowly. Her face showed what her voice couldn't. The fear, the conflict, The exhaustion of someone who wanted to do the right thing but didn't know how to survive it. They've scheduled the vote, he continued. Thursday. No defense. No appeal. Just gone. Miss Aldridge exhaled, her hand tightening around the edge of the desk. I heard. Then you know how this ends if nobody stops it. She nodded once. Her eyes shimmered with something close to shame.
You saw the emails.
You know what they've done to me? You heard Killian joke about putting me in my place. You recorded it. She turned away slightly, as if the memory burned. I did. Then help me, he said. Not quietly. Not from the shadows. Really help me. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to the window and stared out at the empty parking lot. If I come forward, she said finally, I lose everything. Not just my job, my pension, my career, my home, my name in this community. I'll be labeled a traitor. I've seen what this district does to people who speak against it. They'll bury me. Javion stepped closer. They're already burying me.
Those 5 words landed heavy. She flinched.
I just need 48 hours, she whispered, to figure out how, to prepare. Please. He wanted to argue, wanted to demand more. But he could see it. She wasn't lying. She was scared. And fear like hers wasn't cowardice. It was survival. 48 hours, he said. That's all I've got. She nodded again. You deserve better than this. He didn't say thank you. Not because he wasn't grateful, but because justice shouldn't require gratitude to the people who delayed it. That night, Keandra didn't go to work. She called in sick for the first time in years, and stayed at the kitchen table long after midnight, flipping through the printed documents like they were sacred. Javion sat nearby, silent, watching the storm approach one page at a time. I've been cleaning courtrooms for 10 years, she said. Judges, attorneys, cops, I've seen what they do to cases like yours. They bury them in paperwork and lies. This isn't about truth anymore. It's about whether someone's willing to burn for it. The next morning, the school hallways buzzed with rumors. Teachers whispered behind half-closed doors. The student council canceled its meeting. No one said Javion's name out loud, but the tension in the air said it all. A fire was coming. By Wednesday night, Javion sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the ceiling. His phone buzzed. Ms. Aldridge. Still thinking. I'm close. I promise. Keandra stood silently in the hallway, watching the light flicker from his screen, praying that promise would be enough. But what came next wasn't a decision. It was a warning. At 3:42 a.m., in a quiet residential neighborhood on the edge of Stonebridge, a window shattered. The glass exploded inward into Miss Aldridge's living room, shards spreading across the hardwood floor like teeth. The door rattled violently. Shadows moved across the porch, then vanished into darkness. She jolted awake, barefoot, panicked, heart pounding like a war drum. She crept toward the noise, one hand gripping the edge of the hallway wall, and stared at the front of her home, violated, broken, exposed. No one entered. Nothing was stolen. Nothing said. But the message was clear. She didn't call the police. She didn't file a report. She just swept up the glass with shaking hands, bandaged the small cuts on her feet, and sat on the couch, stunned into silence. Her chest ached, her stomach churned, and yet somewhere beneath the fear, something hard. By sunrise, her decision was no longer a question. She picked up her phone and typed one word to Javion. Tomorrow. The night before the expulsion hearing, Miss Aldridge's home is broken into. The auditorium at Stonebridge High had never held this many people. It was only supposed to fit 300, but by the time the sun rose over the cracked concrete of the school's front lot, cars were already stacked curbside. Parents, students, reporters with cell phone rigs, off-duty officers in uniformed silence, they all came, not for a celebration, not for an assembly, but for a reckoning. The school board had insisted this was merely a closed administrative hearing, but everyone knew the truth. Javion Carter, a 16-year-old student with no record, no infractions, no history of violence, was being placed on public trial for having dared to solve a problem too well. The stage wasn't decorated. No banners, no color, just a long oak table facing the rows of metal chairs, and folding bleachers, microphones placed like interrogation tools in front of 5 board members. They looked calm, polished, rehearsed, as if they'd practiced how to look impartial. Javion sat near the front, flanked by Keandra on one side, and Miss Aldridge on the other. His suit was charcoal gray, slightly too big on the shoulders, borrowed from a neighbor whose son had worn it to a scholarship dinner years ago. His hands rested on his lap, fingers intertwined tightly to hide the shaking. He didn't speak, not yet. His eyes scanned the crowd, careful not to lock with anyone too long. The same classmates who had once asked for homework help now sat stone-faced or smirking. The adults who had once nodded at him in hallways now looked through him. A buzz of murmuring filled the air as the room settled. Then came the tap of a mic, sharp, artificial, silencing the crowd. Superintendent Rayburn leaned in, expression unreadable. "We appreciate everyone joining us this morning. Today's matter is a sensitive one, involving academic conduct, staff safety, and the integrity of our learning environment." He turned toward the projection screen behind them. As part of the review process, he continued, "We'd like to present video footage of the incident that initiated our concerns." Lights dimmed. The video began. Javion's heart slowed as the familiar manipulated footage filled the screen. The same 37-second edit that had gone viral, spliced to frame him as volatile. The clip cut before context, paused on his forward step, amplified Mr. Killian's retreat. It played like a trailer for a movie no one bothered to watch in full. As the screen faded to black, murmurs returned, this time laced with whispers. "He really did get loud." He stepped toward him. "That's not respectful behavior." Keandra's jaw clenched. Miss Aldridge's hands twitched nervously in her lap. Rayburn cleared his throat. "This clip, circulated publicly, reflects behavior that concerns us. Our responsibility is to protect every student and staff member. Regardless of intent, this is what we must consider." Another board member, Miss Davenport, the only black woman on the panel, who had remained quiet through most of the meeting, now leaned toward her microphone. "We'll allow the student to speak before final deliberation," she said softly. Javion stood. His knees felt weak. The room leaned in. Every eye locked on him, some hungry for collapse, others waiting for spectacle. He swallowed, looked once at his mother, then at Ms. Aldridge, and stepped toward the microphone. "My name is Javion Carter," he began, voice steady despite the tremble under it. "I'm not here to defend something I didn't do. I'm here to explain what you never let me say." The room hushed. "I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I didn't step forward with violence. I stepped forward because I was being accused. I stepped forward because I solved a problem too well. And instead of celebrating that, you called it suspicious. Instead of asking how, you asked who helped me cheat. Instead of wondering why your system didn't teach me that solution, you wondered how I dared to know it at all." Rayburn opened his mouth, but before he could interject, a voice rang out from the back of the room. "Play the full video." All heads turned. From the aisle, a student stood holding a USB in the air. Behind her, another, then another. A chain of students, some black, some brown, some white, but all holding backup copies of the footage. Miss Aldridge's eyes went wide. The students marched forward and placed the USBs one by one on the table. One of them whispered, "Multiple copies. So you can't pretend you lost it." Rayburn shifted in his seat. "This is highly irregular." Keandra stood. "So is a fake video being treated as truth." Ms. Davenport raised her hand. "Play it." The lights dimmed again. This time, the real video played. The room watched in full silence as the truth unfolded. The full, unedited classroom exchange. Javion calm. Mr. Killian defensive. Javion offering clarification, only to be interrupted. Javion raising his hand, asking to speak. The teacher's voice rising. Javion backing up, not forward. The entire room saw it. The truth they'd been denied. When the lights came back on, the energy had changed. Some in the crowd looked ashamed. Some looked angry. But not at Javion. One woman shouted, "Why wasn't this shown first?" Another called out, "You were gonna ruin this kid over a lie?" Rayburn fumbled with his papers. We had no access to this footage prior to." "Liar," someone muttered. Keandra stepped forward. "You were never looking for the truth. You were building a story. You wanted a problem child, not a prodigy." The room exploded into noise. Reporters snapping photos, students recording, parents standing. One teacher tried to calm the crowd, but it was too late. The walls of quiet racism had cracked. But then, just when it seemed the momentum had shifted, the board called for a recess. 10 minutes passed.
10:20.
Finally, the panel returned. Rayburn's face was tight. Davenport looked disappointed. The gray-suited woman from earlier whispered something into the superintendent's ear, and he nodded slightly before speaking into the mic. After review of all evidence, including the newly submitted footage, he began, "The board has decided not to move forward with expulsion." A wave of relief rippled through the room. Keandra closed her eyes for a moment, clutching her son's hand. Miss Aldridge sighed deeply beside them, but then Rayburn continued. However, Mr. Carter's behavior leading up to the incident indicates a pattern of tension with faculty. As such, the board has agreed to place him on a semester-long academic probation. He will be removed from all leadership positions, extracurriculars, and advanced placement courses, effective immediately. The room froze again. Gasps. Stunned silence. Javion's head turned sharply. You're punishing me. Anyway, Rayburn looked down. This is a compromise, to allow reintegration without further disruption. A parent shouted, That's not justice. Another yelled, He just proved you wrong. Rayburn stood. This meeting is now adjourned. The gavel hit the desk. Javion didn't move. His hands were fists now, shaking not from fear, but from rage. Keandra pulled him close. They're scared, she whispered. That's why they did this. Because they lost, and they need to pretend they didn't. But Javion wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were locked on the board, and in that moment, he wasn't broken. He was building something. The board rules, and the decision isn't what anyone expected. The board called it a compromise. Javion knew better. They hadn't cleared him. They'd caged him inside a school that now looked at him like a problem that hadn't been fully solved. Though expulsion was off the table, everything else had been ripped from under him. Math club, student government, AP science, his mentorship program, the early admission pipeline to MIT. It all vanished like it had never existed. The day after the hearing, he walked into Stonebridge High and felt the shift instantly. His name, once spoken in academic circles with a mix of admiration and envy, was now whispered with bitterness or ignored entirely. Teachers who once greeted him with nods now glanced past him like he wasn't there. Hallways felt colder. Desks farther apart. Silence hung around him like smoke. His locker had been moved to the ground floor near the gym, far from the honors wing, closer to where the school quietly shuffled kids they didn't want to showcase. His new classes were standard level, crowded, chaotic, and mostly filled with students who hadn't heard the full story. But even among them, the whispers found him. He's the one who got into that fight with the teacher, right? I heard he hacked the system and got caught. They let him stay because his mom threatened to sue. Javion stopped correcting people after the third day. Even Ms. Aldridge kept her distance now. Not because she didn't care, but because her presence had become radioactive. Her testimony had made her a pariah among staff, her name missing from faculty newsletters. Her classroom moved to a smaller wing. Every time she saw Javion in the hallway, her eyes carried apology, but they also carried fear. His transcript had a new note added beneath his GPA, academic conduct, under review spring 2024. The kind of mark that followed you, quiet, ambiguous, permanent. It didn't say what happened. It didn't need to. It said enough to raise eyebrows. Enough for MIT to pause. Enough for letters of recommendation to be retracted without explanation. Keandra fought it, filed appeals, called board members, contacted education advocates. But the machine had moved on. The storm was over, and Stonebridge didn't want reminders. The noise had served its purpose. Now the school wanted silence. So Javion gave it to them. He spoke less, studied more, but the motivation that once made him stay after class for extra practice was gone. Not because he didn't care, but because he understood now that excellence wasn't protection. His brilliance had only made him a bigger threat, and threats in places like Stonebridge were not nurtured. They were managed. By mid-April, Keandra's hours had been cut again. One of her office contracts dried up without warning. Javion overheard her talking to a bill collector one night, and saw her wiping tears off her cheeks with the back of her hand as she fried eggs in silence. He didn't say anything. He just started looking for work. The janitorial job came through a temp agency. It was part-time, low pay, no benefits, but it was at Stonebridge High. After hours, when the building emptied and the lights flickered on. Timers. The irony wasn't lost on him. He once stood at the front of room 314, solving calculus proofs. Now he was mopping gum off the tile outside it. At first it stung. Wearing gloves, emptying trash bins in classrooms, where his name had once been announced during morning honors. Seeing his old teammates from math club walk past him at night with earbuds in, pretending not to recognize him. But over time, the sting-numb shame gave way to quiet focus. He worked without complaint, kept his head down, and finished every shift without being noticed. But even ghosts overhear things. One Thursday night, around 8:50 p.m., Javion was cleaning near the administrative wing. Most of the building was already dark, But the front office lights were still on. He heard voices, muffled at first, coming from the copy room. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop. He just paused for a second, catching his breath, when he heard his own name. Javion Carter? That's the one who almost got expelled, right? It was a woman's voice. Crisp. Slightly familiar. Yeah, another replied. Shame, really. Kid was brilliant. Still is. Probably. But after that mess, the board red-flagged his name for future programs. There was a shuffle of papers. Well, that donor we're vetting for the Legacy Scholarship asked about him. Javion's breath hitched. What'd you say? The first voice asked. I told him he's not an active candidate. I didn't even mention the folder. Good. That donor's a traditionalist. He wants clean profiles. Someone who won't attract attention. There was a pause. Then laughter. The kind that didn't need to be loud to be cruel. Javion stood frozen behind the janitor's cart, mop still dripping into the bucket. His mind scrambled to process what he'd just heard. A donor. A scholarship. His name had come up, and they buried it. He waited until the lights turned off and the voices faded into the parking lot before moving again. He didn't cry. He didn't curse. He just stood in that hallway for a long time, staring at the closed door, remembering every late night he'd stayed up studying derivative, remembering every competition he'd crushed without a trophy, remembering how the system didn't need to shout to destroy you. Sometimes all it had to do was whisper behind closed doors. Two administrators discuss a scholarship donor, one Javion never knew existed. The morning after Javion overheard those administrators discussing his erased scholarship eligibility, he woke with a heaviness that felt physical, like gravity had increased overnight just for him. His night shift janitor uniform lay abandoned next to clean sheets that nonetheless offered no rest. Even though the sun pulled light through the curtains, it felt like the beginning of a long eclipse, warmth without illumination. Keandra had already left for her earliest cleaning job before he stirred, but in the empty kitchen he could almost hear her whispered prayers, as she slid toast onto plates on nights when he slept. He didn't reach for the coffee maker. Instead, he returned to his old laptop, the one he'd saved files on months ago, and opened it with a determination colder than fear. It was time to dig deeper into the scholarship he'd heard in the hallway, the one that apparently existed only to exclude him. He typed the name of the award into a search bar, the Marcellus Green Mathematics Merit Scholarship, a name he'd heard once in passing during a school assembly years ago, when Stonebridge High had presented it as a tribute to a beloved black math teacher who died far too young. The idea had always been inspiring on the surface, a legacy of encouragement for students of talent, but the pattern Javion had just overheard suggested something more sinister, a tribute that never truly honored the people it claimed to support. Scholarship committee minutes, donor reports, award lists, they slowly appeared online, some public, some tucked away in PDF reports deep in the district archives. What he saw first made his jaw drop. For 12 straight years, the scholarship had been awarded exclusively to white students, despite it being explicitly designed to honor a black educator, whose mission was to uplift underrepresented students in STEM. The first 3 recipients had average GPAs, but polished extracurriculars. The last 5 were legacies of board members, or children of influential local donors. Not one recipient matched the spirit of the scholarship's stated purpose, and that alone was an injustice. But as he clicked deeper, the injustice became ugly. He found an internal spreadsheet that wasn't meant for public eyes, a PDF hidden in an archived district meeting packet. It included ratings, applicant comments, and committee notes. Someone hadn't bothered to completely scrub it, and there, under ratings for recommendation strength, was a name he'd never expected to see. Rayburn Legacy Fund. Obligation. Prioritization override applied. His breath caught. The scholarship wasn't just biased by negligence or institutional blind spots. It had been rigged through a guideline called legacy prioritization, a clause buried in committee bylaws that allowed certain donors to influence decisions under the guise of maintaining community tradition. It was a loophole so potent it turned merit into decoration and allowed the school's most powerful to decide who deserves success, which meant only students who blended into the existing power structure ever received it. His fingers trembled as he copied screenshots and downloaded files. The scholarship committee, the school board, the superintendent's office, they had been systematically sidelining the very students the scholarship claimed to uplift. The program was not only exclusionary, it was a tool of preference disguised as charity. He didn't tell Keandra at first. He called Ms. Aldridge instead, even though they hadn't spoken much since her home was broken into. Her voice, when she answered, was cautious, but steady. Javion, I was worried about you, she said. He could hear the anxiety in her tone, but also a weary relief, as if part of her knew this moment was coming. I found something, he said softly. Not just that they passed over the scholarship, but why, and who benefits from it. There was a pause, then she replied quietly, send it. He forwarded everything he downloaded, the hidden spreadsheet, donor notes, committee minutes, even the buried bylaws that hadn't been properly vetted or publicly disclosed. After a few minutes, she called back, her voice heavier now. Javion, this is worse than I thought. This isn't just Stonebridge bias. This is systemic preference. It's deliberate. She hesitated. You sure you're ready for what comes next? He didn't answer. He wasn't planning to back down anymore. Still, the public wasn't ready. Not yet. Because before they could go on offense, they needed a platform. And that's when Keandra stormed the district office. She arrived mid-morning, dressed in her work clothes, faded blouse, worn skirt, and a resolve that pressed the world backward. She didn't ask for an appointment. She didn't knock. She simply walked into Superintendent Rayburn's lobby, files in hand, eyes locked on the reception desk. I need to speak to someone in charge, she said, voice calm, but fierce. The receptionist offered a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. Do you have an appointment? No, Keandra replied. But this cannot wait. When the secretary walked away to find someone, Keandra approached the brochure rack. Her fingers brushed over pamphlets about community excellence, student achievement, equal access to scholarships. The irony was sharp enough to cut. She didn't have to wait long. Rayburn appeared, composed, well-pressed suit, expression polite but guarded. Yes, he said, trying for a neutral tone. You know what that scholarship is? She said, before he could form a sentence. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. I'm not sure. Don't do that, she interrupted. Don't pretend you don't know exactly how that scholarship has been awarded for over a decade. Rayburn's smile thinned. I know what you found, he said, voice smooth like a stone being rolled around in someone's hand before it drops. I have proof, Keandra said, lifting her folder. And she did. She presented the files she and Javion had compiled. The donor notes, the hidden prioritization overrides, the committee's internal ratings. Rayburn watched, expression neutral, like a man watching wind turn into fire. I want a public explanation, she said, voice steady even though her heart pounded loud enough to drown out the receptionist chatting behind her. Parents, students, every applicant denied because of this. They deserve answers. Rayburn didn't flinch. Instead, he offered her a seat. The local reporter showed up that afternoon, a woman named Simone Harris, with a reputation for speaking truth to power. She had once broken a story about misallocated school funds that led to corrective reform. So when Keandra's message hit her inbox with subject line, Scholarship Scandal Unmasked, she didn't ignore it. She came to the district office with recorder in hand and questions on her tongue. By late afternoon, a small crowd had gathered across from the administration building. Parents, students, local activists, signs taped to cardboard, reports printed out and flapping in the wind.
Equal access. No more loopholes.
Honor his legacy. Honor all students. The air buzzed with a momentum that felt like uprising. Simone's camera crew panned faces, angry, hopeful, tired, determined. Inside the district office, Javion and Keandra watched the live stream from a hallway monitor. For the first time in months, it felt like someone else was holding the flashlight instead of the shadows. But then the unexpected twist came, as they reviewed the scholarship files again, trying to prepare for what Simone might ask on camera. Javion opened a buried folder within the scholarship archive. Unpublished scholarship amendments. It wasn't just donor influence, it was fraud. The amendment documents showed that the so-called legacy prioritization clause was never properly ratified. It was never voted on. It didn't exist in any official policy manual that was publicly recognized, but it had been quietly used year after year to override merit scores, to place donor picks above higher-scoring applicants, to shape every award into the same predictable outcome, white recipients. But buried under that file was something even bigger, a second spreadsheet labeled Future Scholarship Distribution Strategy, 2025-2030. It looked like a projection plan, except the beneficiaries weren't random. They were named by first and last name, long before they'd even applied. Some of the names were recognizable: the children of influential board members, the kids of district major donors, a local politician's nephew, and deeply buried but unmistakable, a name Javion had never expected to see. Michael Killian, predicted candidate, class of 2027, potential valedictorian sponsorship consideration. The irony was sharp. The man who had demeaned him, dismissed him, and helped set in motion the video that nearly expelled him, was projected years in advance to receive advantage from the very scholarship that promised to honor a black teacher's legacy. Javian stared at the screen, pulse quickening. This wasn't just bias. This was premeditated manipulation. And he now held the document that proved it. He turned to Keandra, and she didn't need to ask. The color drained from her face. "We're going to change the narrative," he said quietly. "But this changes everything. Because this wasn't just discrimination anymore. It was a crime against truth. A pattern of fraud that stretches back 12 years, and Javian has the proof." The morning the story broke, the first sunbeam cutting through the blinds landed like a spotlight on Javian's laptop screen. He and reporter Simone Harris watched the published piece scroll live on Stonebridge Daily, then on state news affiliates, and finally on national education watchdog sites. The headline was blunt and unignorable. "Decades of bias, scholarship fraud and racial gatekeeping at Stonebridge School District." Below it, the analytics counter spun up like an alarm. Views, shares, reposts ticking upward in real time. Javian's heart thudded with a painful mix of vindication and dread. The story wasn't just about him anymore. It had become evidence that a trusted community institution had quietly bred injustice for more than a decade. Simone had done more than publish files. She had threaded the narrative together. The hidden bylaws, the donor influence, the pattern of diverting a scholarship meant to uplift underrepresented math talent into a system of predictable advantage for insiders. Her writing didn't just report. It forced readers to confront a truth they had refused to see. Thousands responded immediately. Alumni calling in with memories of overlooked opportunities, parents demanding accountability, students sharing old essays and scholarship applications that had been rejected without explanation. The air around Stonebridge High grew electric with exposure, the kind that demanded acknowledgement, not silence. Local news crews swarmed the building, cameras trained on the brick facade that had once only held echoes of adolescent routine. Now it was the epicenter of outrage and inquiry. Reporters pounded microphones into the faces of administrators who had once held power behind closed doors, but who now smiled thinly and muttered rehearsed reassurances about ongoing internal reviews. Some teachers who had watched Javian struggle in silence now spoke cautiously on camera, distancing themselves from the system that had cultivated bias. Others declined to comment, their posture stiff, their eyes darting away from lenses that seemed eager to pin them down. State education officials issued a press release that morning, confirming they were opening a formal investigation into Stonebridge's scholarship practices, administrative transparency, and potential violations of educational equity laws. The state's attorney general had been alerted. Civil rights groups called for an emergency hearing. Suddenly, the story wasn't isolated. It was systemic. It had become what Simone described in an interview as the hidden crisis of educational inequity that every district claims to solve, but few ever confront. The town itself split like tectonic plates. On Main Street, shopkeepers posted supportive signs, "Truth matters," and "Justice for all students." But outside the high school gates, a smaller contingent stood with placards reading, "Protect our schools, and don't let one story define us." At every turn, voices clashed, parents with teary pleas for accountability, others furious that their proud district was being painted as racist. Some insisted the whole controversy was a hoax, engineered by overzealous outsiders. The divide wasn't just ideological, it was emotional, generational, familial. It was a town tearing itself open to see whether its foundation was ever meant to bear all of its people. Amid the chaos, Javian moved with cautious purpose. He wasn't sure when his anger had evolved into resolve, but by the time cameras first captured his face on live television, he was ready to stand in the narrative, rather than behind it. Simone had coached him through media training. She had steeled him for tough questions, but no amount of preparation eased the rawness of being called a symbol of injustice, rather than a student with a story. Every question from a reporter felt like a pull on an open wound. Was he bit? Was he still hurt? Did he want restitution? Was he angry at white people, at teachers, at the system? His answer, always the same, was quieter than the accusation. He didn't want revenge. He wanted the truth to have consequences. He wanted systems that promised equality to be held to that promise. That distinction was thin, but it mattered deeply to him. Still, as the spotlight grew brighter, so did the intensity of scrutiny. Distant relatives who hadn't spoken to him in years called with vague condolences. Strangers sent messages laced with both support and hostility. Colleges, including MIT, reached out to say they were rescinding admissions decisions until the matter was resolved. Even those who stood by him were often unsure how to articulate their loyalty without sounding performative. Javion began to feel the isolation that comes when a personal story becomes public property. Then came the invitation from the State Education Board, a formal request for Javion to testify at a televised hearing. They wanted him to lay out the timeline, the evidence, the emotional toll. They wanted him to articulate not just what happened to him, but what it revealed about inequity statewide. Simone called it an opportunity for justice, not spectacle. But Javion felt the weight of it, like a cold stone settled in his chest. "Mom," he said one night, sitting across from Keandra at the kitchen table, his eyes tired but sharp. "I have to tell them everything. Not just the scholarship, not just the files, but how it felt to be erased in plain sight." Keandra reached out and squeezed his hand. Her voice soft but resolute. "You're not just speaking for yourself," she said. "You're speaking for every kid who ever got told they weren't enough. That alone is important." He nodded, but his eyes flickered somewhere between gratitude and fear. Testifying before the state board meant reliving every slight, every dismissal, every quiet moment of erasure. It meant speaking in front of powerful adults who had already shown they preferred quiet compliance over uncomfortable truth. The board hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and so Monday arrived like a gauntlet. Javion woke with a restless urgency. The sky was bruised gray, like the weather itself knew the day demanded tension. Keandra made coffee without speaking, her presence calm but aware, the kind of calm that happens when long battles settle into a moment of consequence. Miss Aldridge had reached out early that morning, with cautious encouragement, reminding him to breathe, to speak clearly, and to remember that truth shouldn't bend under pressure. Javion left the house wearing his suit again, the same one he had worn during the expulsion hearing, now threadbare with memories that were both terrible and transformative. He didn't look in the mirror. Instead, he caught his reflection in the car window and saw a boy hardened, not by defeat but by tenacity. The ride to the state capitol was quiet. Keandra didn't offer platitudes. She didn't need to. She simply drove beside him, a steady presence against the growing storm of thoughts in his head. At the Capitol building, reporters waited. Cameras were already set up on every corner. Protesters from both sides clustered near the entrance. A buzz of microphones, placards, chants, and echoed chants rippled through the plaza. Javion and Keandra walked up the steps like spectators to another world, one where the stakes were heavier than grades, heavier than gossip, heavier than any fear Javion had ever known. Inside the hearing room, the board was already seated at a long, curved desk elevated above the floor. State officials, legal counsel, and microphones all swiveled toward the empty witness chair. The room was larger than any classroom Javion had ever stood in, larger than the auditorium where he had once faced the expulsion vote, larger than his own fears. When his name was called, he rose slowly. His heart didn't race. Instead, it beat with purpose. He walked to the stand, saw Miss Aldridge sitting quietly in the gallery, and then Keandra, her eyes steady and proud. He took a breath and began, not just with facts but with feeling. He spoke of nights in libraries, of stolen opportunities, of being watched instead of taught. He spoke of how brilliance had been mistaken for threat, how his name had been red-flagged, simply for wanting to belong. He spoke of the scholarship that was supposed to honor a black teacher but instead perpetuated bias. He spoke until his voice trembled, then steadied. He spoke until the room was silent, not with agreement but with attention. And when he finally finished, there was a long pause, the kind that feels like a collective inhale before judgment. Then the board chair cleared his throat and said, "Thank you, Mr. Carter. Your testimony will be entered into the record." Outside, cameras flashed. Reporters asked questions, but nothing prepared them for what happened that night. Late Monday evening, well after the hearings had recessed, and state officials had gone home, the Carter household was rocked by a loud crash. Glass shattered. A brick flew through the living room window. It landed in the center of the floor, surrounded by shards of glass reflecting streetlights through torn curtains. Taped to the brick was a small handwritten note. Javion picked it up with gloved fingers. He didn't have to read it to know what it would say. But he did. It read in jagged letters, "Stay silent or stay buried." And in that moment, the movement he had ignited collided with the fear the world still wielded. A brick through the window, with a note that reads, "Stay silent or stay buried." By the time the brick shattered their window, Javion Carter's story had already broken out of the confines of Stonebridge. What began as a local school controversy became a national narrative about bias, buried records, and the quiet machinery of inequity. It started with a segment on CNN that morning, his face on the split screen, his words summarizing the scholarship fraud and systemic preference, then an in-depth piece on NPR, where an education correspondent spoke not just about him, but about similar patterns in districts across the country. The Washington Post published an investigative follow-up that evening, focusing on hidden scholarships, donor influence, and the power imbalances that had reshaped Javion's future. Overnight, his name ceased to be a scandal. It became a symbol, one that didn't ask for reverence, but demanded reckoning. The attention was overwhelming. Celebrities retweeted his story. Some posted tearful videos in support of his courage. A well-known former athlete pledged to match donations to a GoFundMe campaign that had been quietly created for Javion's college fund. Within hours, the fund exploded. 6 figures in commitments from strangers who didn't know him but saw in his struggle a mirror of the larger racial fault lines in American education. But for every voice lifting him up, there was another dragging him down. Trolls flooded comments with hate speech, racial slurs hidden in the guise of free speech. Emails arrived with threats, warnings, and demands that he stop this narrative or face consequences. The duality of love and loathing came fast and loud, and Javion had never experienced anything like it. Keandra watched the escalation with a mixture of pride and dread. When she saw the GoFundMe total flash on her phone, she blinked twice, as if the numbers might be a mirage, 10 times what she ever imagined. A piece of paper with a few $100,000 attached, college tuition, travel costs, even living expenses, suddenly within reach. But then her eyes flicked back to a barrage of comments below. Supporters wishing him success, interspersed with venomous posts that accused him of attention-seeking, lying, and destroying a good school's reputation. She took a deep breath and turned toward her son, who watched the scroll quietly, face calm but hurt deep inside. "It's a lot," she said gently. He didn't look away from the screen. "It's not all for me," he replied. "It's for every kid who was told their success was a threat. It's every silent file, every ignored achievement." His voice was soft, but there was a steel underneath it, a core that had been carved out by months of challenge and scrutiny. He wasn't just reacting anymore, he was articulating something larger than himself. Then came the invitation that stunned him further. An offer to speak at a national education summit in Washington, D.C., a high-profile event where policymakers, educators, and influencers gathered to shape the future of schooling in the United States. When the email arrived, Javion stared at it for a long moment. It was an acknowledgement he had never expected. Not from the beginning, not through the darkest hours. But the invitation came with one condition. He must remain politically neutral in his remarks. The organizers wanted him to talk about equity, about scholarship integrity, about student experience, but only within safe, nonpartisan frames. No accusations, no indictments, no controversial conclusions about systemic racism. The email specified. It read like a polite request, but he knew what it truly was. An attempt to contain, to sanitize, to neutralize the force his story had become. When he spoke to Keandra about it, she listened without interruption, her eyes steady, her jaw firm. "Neutrality is a luxury for those who don't have to choose between justice and safety," she said finally. "They want your story, but they want the idea of it more than the truth." Javion nodded. "That's exactly it. They want a version of me that's safe to celebrate, not the version that rattles cages." Still, he understood their position. The summit was national, a chance to elevate issues beyond his personal story. If he did it right, he could talk about discrimination, funding disparities, hidden institutional bias, and the hidden mechanisms that erased students like him. He didn't have to harshly condemn, he just had to illuminate. The day of the summit arrived, with an early brisk wind that pulled the breath from Javion's lungs. As he stepped out of the car near the conference center, protest groups had gathered outside, some supportive, holding signs declaring equity now and truth in education. Others stood with placards that read "Protect our schools," and "Not a political stage." Even here, neutrality demanded a choice he didn't fully want to make. Inside, the hall was cavernous, a vast expanse of chairs, podiums, LED banners, and polished wood. Reporters filed in, attendees placed their programs on lapels, and panelists whispered notes into earpieces. The summit organizers greeted him cordially, but the tension was unmistakable. Everyone wanted to be part of the moment, but not everyone wanted the moment to be disruptive. Javion's name appeared on the big screen, followed by the title of his segment, "Towards Equitable Opportunity," voices that shape the future. It was a safe description, a line that promised inclusivity without confrontation, a sentence crafted to invite applause, not challenge the audience. When Javion stood backstage, waiting for his cue, he saw Ms. Aldridge in the audience, eyes bright with tears, shoulders tense with pride. Keandra stood beside her, holding a printed copy of a news clip, whispering something to a local activist who had come to show solidarity. Javion inhaled slowly, feeling the magnitude of the space around him. Cameras, lights, microphones, and a sea of faces ready to listen. The host introduced him with polite applause. Javion stepped up, adjusted the mic, and the room quieted. The expectation was clear, a moving but uncontroversial speech about resilience and equity.
And then he opened his mouth.
I wasn't invited here to be neutral about the future. I was invited here to help shape it. Gasps rippled through the room. He didn't pause. His voice was calm but sharp, reverberating against the chandeliers overhead. It's important to talk about opportunity. It's essential to celebrate achievement. But we cannot have opportunity if we're choosing who gets it before students even apply, before they've even taken their first step into a classroom. We cannot celebrate equity while protecting systems that were never designed to share it. Even as he spoke, a collective intake of breath filled the hall. Some attendees leaned forward with approval. Others frowned, uncomfortable with the weight of his words. I was told to speak without politics, but I refused to divorce truth from policy, because policy is what made my story not just possible but common. When donors dictate who gets opportunity, when legacy overrides merit, when invisible files contain invisible bias, that is not just an educational problem, that is a moral crisis. The room was hushed now. No polite applause, no diplomatic nods, just stillness, that sharp, unmistakable quiet that happens when someone says something true in a place that never expected it. Then he paused, and added something no one predicted. I want to thank every person who supported me, and I want to thank every person who doubted me, because without both, this dialogue would never have begun. But I'm not here to ask for reform. I'm here to insist on accountability. The audience shifted. A few people stood, clapping loudly. Others sat rigidly. Some looked around at one another, whispering. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras captured every word. He continued, his voice steady. Equity is not neutral. Justice is not neutral. Progress is not neutral. If you ask a child of color to be neutral about their opportunity, you ask them to sit quietly while their dreams are ranked below others before they are even heard. That line, that truth, tore through the room. A murmur rose. Supporters cheered. Others booed softly, sanctimonious about keeping politics out of education. But Javion didn't flinch. He looked across the audience, past the bifurcation of opinion, and spoke to something deeper than division. I stand here not just as a statistic, not just as a controversy. I stand here as a student who once believed his future was written in equations, not erased by agendas. If we are to build a system that serves all children, we must first acknowledge the systems that were never meant to serve them. At that moment, the hall fell fully silent, the kind of silence that felt heavier than noise. People didn't just listen, they absorbed. And in that absorption, there was discomfort, inspiration, anger, awakening, and most of all, truth. The applause, when it finally came, was not polite. It was deep, genuine, and layered with emotion. Not everyone joined in, and that tension only made the moment sharper. Cameras flashed. Microphones trailed him as he walked off stage. But somewhere in the back of the hall, a group of policymakers whispered urgently into phones, their faces flushed with anxiety. It was no longer a neutral moment. It was a turning point. And Javion had just said something the nation wasn't prepared to hear. Javion walks on stage and opens with a sentence no one expected. After the summit speech rippled through news cycles and social feeds, offers came in like disconnected thunderclaps, startling, loud, and impossible to ignore. Talent agents reached out with polished messages offering Javion a brand partnership that promised fame and a speaking circuit designed to frame his experience as a heartwarming overcoming adversity story. Universities extended fast-track admissions packages, personalized welcome videos, ready to be uploaded with his likeness and his name in glowing, non-threatening letters. Even a documentary team reached out with promises of inspiration without controversy. A narrative arc that ended with him smiling, cap and gown, wormhole removed, erased from systemic critique. Every offer was tied to a story they wanted, a sanitized victory lap, applause without accountability, A black success that made audiences feel good but didn't ask them to change anything. None of it was what Javion wanted. Late one night, in the quiet of their living room, where shadows gathered around the edges, Keandra and Javion sat with spreadsheets of proposals printed in neat columns. Some promised wealth, others promised visibility. The hardest part wasn't the praise, it was the shape it took. Nice, comfortable, packaged for viewership, void of the truth he knew lived in every paragraph of his story. Look at this one, Keandra said, pointing to a glossy email that sounded almost encouraging. We want to turn your journey into a docuseries that ends on hope, with emphasis on healing and inspiration. She shrugged. They want the headline of your experience without the guts of it. Javion placed his finger on the corner of the page, eyes unmoved. They want me to be the hero only where it's convenient, he said. Nobody wants the part that unsettles them. And the part that unsettled them wasn't just his pain. It was their collective culpability. The next morning, he met with his attorney, a soft-spoken civil rights lawyer named Miriam Sutton, whose office walls were lined with framed cases of landmark victories against institutions much larger than Stonebridge. She didn't look at him with pity. She looked at him with strategy. Your story combined with the files we uncovered, she said, spreading documents out like a battlefield map, isn't just a local controversy. It shows a pattern of systemic racial bias, donor suppression, and deliberate misrepresentation of scholarship opportunities. We can file a federal civil rights lawsuit. Javion exhaled, letting the gravity of her words settle. This isn't about money, he said quietly. It has never been about money. It's about justice, Miriam said. About changing record-keeping practices, scholarship transparency, accountability from school boards. You could make sure no student goes through this again. He didn't respond right away. He looked out the window at a world that still felt too small and too vast at the same time. A world where facts had become flashpoints and truth had become a tightrope. Okay, he finally said. Let's file. The complaint was filed in federal court, under the Civil Rights Act. Weeks after filing, former students started reaching out anonymously at first, then with real names and tearful emails. A black girl who'd been denied advanced science courses, a Latinx boy who was graded down for not fitting classroom norms, a biracial young woman whose transfer application was mysteriously delayed until deadlines passed. Every story shared a pattern. Students punished or minimized for excellence or behavior that never drew the same scrutiny when white peers exhibited it. The media began calling it the Stonebridge pattern, a phrase that felt grotesquely poetic. It wasn't just a story about one boy anymore. It was becoming the narrative of multiple overlooked lives, a tapestry of quiet injustices woven into the district's record. The school board lawyer, an ivory-collared man named Carlton Voss, called one afternoon with an offer. His voice was polite, rehearsed, careful, as if trying to mask the tension behind each word. We'd like to propose a settlement, he said, to resolve this matter without further litigation. Javion and Miriam sat across from a polished desk in Voss's office, the blinds casting horizontal lines across the endless legalese printed on crisp paper. Voss slid a thick document across the table. We are prepared to offer a significant financial package, he said, plus covered tuition at several partner institutions, provided your client signs a confidential agreement, a standard non-disclosure clause. Miriam's eyes flicked to Javion. He didn't flinch. His gaze stayed on Voss, steady and unblinking. Let me be clear, Voss continued. We have no doubt the allegations have drawn attention. But litigation can be lengthy, costly, and emotionally taxing. This settlement allows the district to make amends without prolonged public scrutiny. Javion looked at the contract's bolded lines. No admission of guilt, no disclosure of records, and the restrictive clause preventing him from ever speaking publicly about anything related to Stonebridge again. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the same weight that had woven itself into his bones months ago. After the altered video, after whispers and removals and suspicious transcripts, this wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't justice. It was containment. Let me ask you something, Mr. Voss, Javion said, his voice controlled but ice-edged. If this was about amends, why does this contract silence me? Why is my voice, part of what you want, erased? Voss shifted in his seat, but didn't back down. It's standard in these cases. We want to protect all parties from unnecessary fallout. Protection, Javion said, isn't my concern. Accountability is. Voss exhaled. He looked past Javion, through the office window at a quiet street below, as if that view somehow justified the offer. Think of it as an exit, he said, a dignified one. That single word, dignified, felt like ash in Javion's mouth. It was everything he wasn't asking for. Dignity without truth was just another mask. He stood up. Miriam stood with him, placing a steady hand on his back. "We'll consider it," Javion said, "but we will not sign anything that silences the truth." They left the office, the settlement document still on the desk like a silent threat. Back in the car, Miriam exhaled heavily. "You could settle," she said, "and walk into an institution that's ready to celebrate you." Javion stared out the window as the city's lights stretched into dusk. "That's exactly the problem," he murmured. "They're ready to celebrate a version of me that fits their comfort. But I'm not here to be comfortable." Weeks passed. More former students came forward. One produced emails that showed teachers joking about lowering black students' expectations. Another found a report from years earlier in which a white parent had quietly called a board member complaining about those overachieving kids. A phrase that sent ripples through old minutes and triggered suppressed flags on student accounts. The more evidence collected, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't isolated. It was institutional. The press conferences became frequent. Lawyers, civil rights advocates, past students and their parents, they gathered on steps of courthouses, under bright cameras and sharper questions. The tide had turned from a single story to a collective voice. But the district remained unrepentant. One day, Javion received an email marked urgent from an address he didn't recognize. The subject line was short. "We know where it really started." His fingers hovered over the mousepad before he opened it. When he did, his eyes scanned the message, then widened. The email contained a single attachment, a transcript of an audio file, recorded years ago inside a faculty meeting, that had never been publicly acknowledged. The header of the transcript noted the date and a shorthand label "Stonebridge Staff Strategy." What followed were lines of dialogue, stripped only of background noise but otherwise intact. "We can manage the narrative on scholarships. Keep it within our trusted channels. Donors should see return. Standardized criteria so those who matter most benefit. Tracking performance, but flag those who destabilize the status quo." And then one voice stood out. Unmistakable. "If a black student even shows tomorrow what Javion did in calculus, make sure no one remembers who he is." Javion's breath caught. It wasn't just bias disguised as procedure. It wasn't just neglect. It was premeditated silencing. And that audio, if authentic, wasn't just evidence. It was confession. Keandra read over his shoulder, her face pale. "This changes everything," she whispered. He closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of every moment that had led to this. Every whispered dismissal, every erased opportunity, every quiet shove to the margins. "This isn't just a lawsuit anymore," he said. "It's accountability, and people should be named." Miriam stood behind them, eyes sharp. "We need to verify this. Fast." But even as she spoke, Javion knew the next step would demand more than truth. It would demand exposure, and there was nothing neutral about that. Javion's eyes scanned the document, then slowly slid it back across the table. "Here's my counter." The courthouse stood like a cathedral of justice on the first day of the trial, its neoclassical columns dwarfing the crowd gathered outside. In the early morning light, reporters clustered around the iron gates, their cameras trained on the revolving door, where Javion Carter and his legal team entered like pilgrims marching toward reckoning. The air was heavy with anticipation, and not just from the media. Parents of students who had privately reached out, former Stonebridge scholars who had been marginalized, community activists, and civil rights lawyers from across the state filled the gallery seats before the proceedings even began. What was intended as a courtroom battle had already become a public phenomenon, and everyone sensed that this was more than a lawsuit. It was a reckoning. Inside, the prosecution's opening statements were clear and unflinching. Miriam Sutton stood before the jury like a lawyer who had spent years preparing for this exact moment. Her voice was steady, her focus unwavering. She described a pattern of deliberate behavior by the Stonebridge School District: manipulated scholarship practices, hidden donor influence, coded employee reports that disproportionately targeted black and brown students, and internal discussions that sought to silence excellence when it challenged the comfortable status quo. Each allegation was accompanied by evidence. Emails where administrators couched bias in academic hierarchy concerns. Scholarship committee notes that systematically deprioritized high-achieving students of color, and the now infamous audio transcript from years ago, where a board member was recorded saying, "If a black student even shows tomorrow what Javion did in calculus, make sure no one remembers who he is." The courtroom was still when she said it, still in the way of people realizing they were hearing not just accusation but admission. The defense, predictable in its strategy, pleaded ignorance. Stonebridge's lawyer stood at the lectern and read prepared statements about institutional tradition, standardized evaluation metrics, and the importance of preserving the school's reputation. Board members, appearing one by one on the stand, echoed the same refrain. There was no malicious intent. We operated within policy. We were trying to uphold educational excellence. Some looked genuinely uncomfortable. Others looked as though they were reciting lines they'd drilled over and over in preparation. A few teachers, called reluctantly as witnesses, spoke in gentle, hesitant tones about how difficult it had been to reconcile internal criticism with district loyalty. Some had tears in their eyes, not for the harm they had witnessed, but for the consequences of admitting they'd been complicit in something they had once justified as normal practice. There were moments when they seemed honest in regret, and moments when their regret sounded like fear of consequence rather than empathy for harm. But the prosecution had prepared meticulously. Every claim, every document, every testimony was corroborated. Emails where legacy prioritization was discussed as a way to maintain community standards. Scholarship selection spreadsheets where donor families' children were preloaded as top candidates before application windows even closed. Internal reports where specific phrases were used to describe students of color, phrases that, when compared against white students' reports, revealed a clear pattern of bias cloaked in clinical language. All of it was laid before the jury in stark contrast. Official policy versus internal practice, intent versus impact, what a school said it valued versus what its actions reveal. On the final day of testimony, Javion was called to the stand. He rose slowly, the weight of every step heavier than the one before. He looked out at the jury, a mix of ages, races, genders, none of whom he knew personally, yet all of whom held the power to define the meaning of his experience for the world. He didn't speak with anger. He spoke with clarity that had been honed through months of reflection and struggle. I learned calculus because I love it, he said, eyes steady. I didn't learn it to make people uncomfortable. I didn't learn it to challenge someone's authority. I learned it because the world of ideas, numbers, logic, patterns, was where I felt seen. And when I stepped forward that day, I wasn't trying to prove any of you wrong. I was just doing what I had practiced 1,000 times alone, in silence. What happened afterward wasn't an accident. It was a response to a system that never imagined someone like me would exist within it. His voice didn't waver. It resonated. In the gallery, Ms. Aldridge sat with tears she hadn't bothered to hide. Next to her, former students nodded grimly, as if hearing for the first time the verbalization of things they had quietly felt for years. Keandra, in the front row, closed her eyes at one point, not in sorrow but in that sharp, deep inhalation of hope that comes when truth is finally uttered out loud. The jury retired for deliberation, a somber procession through the wood-paneled corridors. Hours passed, then minutes, then a moment of hushed anticipation, when the court clerk re-entered the room, calling the assembly back to order. When the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict, there was a silence in the room so deep it felt like collective breath held. We find in favor of the plaintiff. The words landed like thunder, and then relief flooded through the gallery. Some cried. Others exhaled like they had been holding air for too long. For the first time in months, it felt like justice wasn't just a concept, it was real. But the impact rippled far beyond that room. News networks interrupted regular programming. Headlines blazed across screens. Landmark verdict. School district held accountable for decades of bias. Civil rights groups called it a watershed moment. Education boards across the state began internal reviews of their own policies. Parents demanded transparency. Students held rallies. Some districts pledged reform. Others issued guarded statements of solidarity with the verdict, and caveats about uniqueness of their systems. The decision didn't just affect Stonebridge, it sent shockwaves across state lines. Even as the applause echoed, and the reporters crowded around him, Javion's victory wasn't the kind he expected. At a press conference the next day, cameras swirled, lights flashed. One reporter asked, "Javion, now that you've won, what do you plan to do next?" Another asked, "Will you attend college with the funds raised for you?" A third asked, "Do you feel this is a turning point for racial equity in education?" Javion answered every question with grace and focus, emphasizing accountability, systemic change, and support for students similarly harmed. But after the press dispersed, after interviews were aired, and clips posted across thousands of screens, something unexpected settled in his chest. A quiet that wasn't relief. It was the kind of silence that follows an exhausting battle, one where you win not just a case, but years of suppressed truth. Back in Stonebridge, triumph felt muted. Keandra tried to celebrate. She cried. She embraced him. She spoke to neighbors and friends, with trembling pride. But Jevayon walked through his front door, and felt something else. Hollowness. The victory was real. The injustice had been exposed. But the victory had no soundtrack, no confetti, no marching song of triumph. It sounded instead like empty classrooms and late nights of quiet toil. He wandered through the house, passing photos of old report cards, sketches of equations he once loved, reminders of a boy who didn't know how heavy the world could be. And then he headed toward the one place that had always felt like home, his old high school. When he entered the building, the custodial staff glanced up surprised to see him in a suit instead of his night shift uniform. The hallways were quiet, a few lockers open, fluorescent lights buzzing as they always had. He walked past rooms where his name had been whispered with doubt, past the cafeteria where no one sat beside him, past the auditorium that once voted on his expulsion. Finally, he came to room 314, the classroom where the calculus problem had changed everything. The door was closed, the blinds partially drawn, sunlight sifting in like distant memory. He stepped inside. The desks were still in their regular rows. The whiteboard was clean now, the equations gone, but the ghost of what once covered it still visible to those who knew the story. He didn't sit. He didn't lean. He just stood in the center of the room, breathing in the silence like an old refrain. Then, in one fluid motion, he reached out and picked up a piece of chalk from the tray below the board. His fingers tightened around it. And in that moment, the courtroom victories, media triumphs, national accolades, and social media narratives fell away, leaving him with one fundamental truth. The chalkboard still awaited answers. The room still demanded clarity, and the lesson was far from over. Instead of celebrating, Javion walks into an empty classroom and picks up a piece of chalk. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Stonebridge High, illuminating a school that looked cleaner, newer, and somehow lighter than Javion remembered. He stood at the entrance, not as an outsider, not as a ghost of what once was, but as its youngest principal ever appointed. His tie was straight, his posture confident, but his fingers still brushed the edge of the laminated visitor name tag with the same reverence a musician might touch a worn instrument before a performance. It wasn't vanity that made him pause, it was memory, the weight of days spent walking past these corridors when every step felt like an uphill climb through thick fog. Now the fog was gone, replaced by purpose and possibility. Walking through the halls, teachers waved, some by name, some with respectful nods. Instead of avoidance, there was acknowledgement. Students streamed into classrooms. The buzz of conversation replaced old patterns of exclusion. Instead of sidelong glances, he heard laughter, not the mocking laughter of before, but the kind that comes from genuine belonging. It was a rhythm of sound he had once thought impossible in this place, the kind of echo that meant the school had healed and continued to grow, not just survived a moment of reckoning, but learned from it. Teachers who had once whispered about him with thinly veiled resentment now greeted him with thoughtful respect. Some had even admitted their own past blind spots in faculty meetings, sharing stories of how Javion's experience had changed them. One math teacher told him quietly, "You taught us what it means to see, not just look." Another, more hesitant, confessed, "I was afraid of change, but I was wrong." Words like this didn't sting. They just reminded him how wide the chasm had once been, and how far the school had come. There were trophies in the display cases, now that bore names of students from every background. A diversity and equity board met regularly, charting new curriculum goals and creating scholarship programs that honored both excellence and access. Javion had insisted that the new financial aid boards be transparent and student-led, every decision written, logged, and made public for anyone to see. Stonebridge had become a model district for others who once dismissed equity as an inconvenient buzzword. Despite all of that, every morning began with a ritual. Javion walked to room 314, the place where his entire journey had irrevocably changed. It wasn't a quiet pilgrimage. There were others walking near him, a custodian who had once watched him mop tiles at night, a student who once mocked his ambition and now apologized sincerely as a fellow educator, and a parent who thanked him for transforming a system that had failed her child. Today, though, was different. Today was the day he would face the board, not as a defendant in a lawsuit or a symbol of controversy, but as a leader entrusted with the school's future. He opened the door to room 314 and stood in its center, breathing in the hollow quiet that seemed to hold all the echoes of the past. The desks were arranged in neat clusters now, not rows. There were colorful posters on the walls, celebratory math quotes, student achievements, and equity pledges. Every corner of the room now spoke of possibility, not judgment. His eyes traveled to the whiteboard. There, inscribed neatly in black marker, was the faded outline of a complex calculus problem. The very first one he had solved years ago when life pivoted on laughter and disbelief and dismissal. The board had been repainted many times, but someone had traced the old problem underneath, not erased, but honored. It was a testament to history's weight and the value of remembering exactly how far one had come. He ran his thumb gently over the tray below the board, where clean markers stood ready. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just stood there, absorbing the quiet, as though hearing the silence itself was part of the lesson. And then, the bell rang. A nervous shuffle in the doorway. Javion turned. A young black student stepped in hesitantly, backpack too large for his shoulders, eyes wide with the kind of tentative hope that still lived in the hearts of those waiting to be seen. The boy looked out of place, and yet somewhere in his gaze, Javion saw himself a decade earlier, the same mixture of uncertainty and readiness. The student's eyes traveled around the room, pausing at the whiteboard, then landing on Javion. "Sir," the boy said, voice soft but clear. I think I know how to solve that." Javion didn't say a word at first. He only watched the boy raise his hand slightly. Nervous, hopeful, unguarded. It wasn't a dramatic pause. It was a moment of recognition that a new chapter had begun, that the school he once feared had become a place where confidence could be nurtured, rather than punished. The room was silent, but this time the silence was not suffocating. It was respectful. It waited. Javion smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling not with the weight of past hurt, but with understanding. He walked slowly to the board, marker in hand, and motioned toward the empty space beside the equation. "Come on up," he said. The boy exhaled. A breath that sounded like relief and excitement rolled into one. He stepped forward, knees slightly shaking, and took the marker Javion offered him. The classroom watched, not with judgment, not with disbelief, but with anticipation. Javion stepped back and leaned against a desk, watching as the boy traced his fingers over the problem, as though reading an old friend's name in a story too long forgotten. The camera in the corner, one left over from when the room had been retrofitted for hybrid learning, recorded the moment. But it wasn't social media anymore. This wasn't a moment to be sensationalized. This was real. This was growth. This was respect. Javion's mind didn't drift to the trials, the lawsuits, the news cycles, the threats or the applause. It only focused on the boy's trembling first strokes on the board, the way his breath caught when he began to write, the careful way he formed equations as though shaping his own future with each line. The room stayed silent, but this silence was not void. It was meaning-filled, a kind of reverent quiet that welcomed participation, fostered belonging, and demanded no apology for brilliance. As the boy continued to write, Javion's eyes softened. He remembered what it felt like to be that student, to raise a hand that once invited laughter, to step toward a board that once felt like a battlefield. That memory didn't hurt him now. It guided him. And as he watched every line the boy wrote, he saw not a repeat of his past, but its transformation. Then, something unexpected, a subtle creak from the hallway. Javion turned, expecting to see a teacher or a student, or the custodian. Instead, it was the one person no one anticipated, the white student from years ago who had laughed the loudest, the one whose mockery once echoed through that same hall. The boy paused mid-equation. Javion's pulse skipped momentarily, not with anxiety but recognition of how far both had come. The former mocker stood there awkwardly, hands in pockets, eyes unsure. He hadn't been invited. He hadn't even signed up for the class. Yet here he was. Javion didn't scowl. He didn't recoil. He closed his eyes for a second, breathing in the calm steadiness that came from having survived more than a decade of conflict and uncertainty. When he opened them, they held something steadier, acceptance and readiness. He didn't say a word. Instead, he looked at the boy writing on the board, then back at the student who once embodied disdain, now awkward empathy. And with a composure forged from every trial and triumph before this moment, he turned slightly, letting the quiet, rich, respectful, resonant, fill the room. The camera zoomed in on the equation. It was the same one from years ago. But this time, the room was silent, with respect. And then the young student at the board stopped writing and looked directly at Javion. His voice was soft, but firm. "Sir, there's something different about this one." Before Javion could answer, the classroom door clicked open again, And in the doorway stood someone no one expected. Someone whose presence would change the meaning of the final problem entirely. The camera zooms in on the equation. It's the same one from years ago, but this time, the room is silent with respect. If you believe no student should ever be punished for being brilliant, type yes in the comments. What would you do if your child was silenced for simply raising their hand? Subscribe for more true stories that uncover the truth schools try to hide. Together, we tell what others try to erase.